Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe and explore. The battlefield stretched like a graveyard of fallen titans, vast and desolate, illuminated by the eerie light of a dying alien star. The remnants of shattered starships lay scattered across the barren ground, their metal frames twisted and charred. Smoke curled into the sky in ghostly tendrils, a silent testament to the chaos that had unfolded here. Among the wreckage, a lone figure clung to life. Ethan Cade lay sprawled against the cold hull of his downed ship, his breathing shallow and ragged. Blood seeped from a gash along his temple, staining his dark combat suit. His chest rose and fell in uneven rhythms, every breath a battle. His hand gripped a small medallion, its surface etched with the image of Earth, a reminder of a world he had left behind, a home that now felt like a distant dream. His vision blurred as the edges of consciousness wavered. The cold seeped into his bones, and the silence of the battlefield wrapped around him like a shroud. He tried to focus on the medallion, its edges biting into his palm, grounding him in the faintest whisper of hope. Yet deep down, he knew. The odds of survival were slim, and the weight of inevitability pressed down on him like the crushing gravity of a dead star. And then he heard it, a hum, faint at first, like a distant vibration on the edge of his awareness. It grew louder, resonating through the wreckage, distinct and unfamiliar. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, his gaze searching the smoky horizon. Against the backdrop of desolation, a light emerged, soft and ethereal, cutting through the gloom like a shard of moonlight. The figure stepped into view, and for a moment, Ethan thought he was hallucinating. She was tall, her form impossibly graceful, her movements so fluid they seemed otherworldly. Her skin glowed faintly, a soft iridescence that shifted with the light, and her eyes, those eyes, were unlike anything he had ever seen. Luminous and opalescent, they seemed to hold the secrets of galaxies, their depths endless and magnetic. She moved closer, her presence both soothing and unnervingly powerful. Her features defied human standards of beauty, yet they held a captivating allure. Her hair flowed like liquid silver, and her gaze locked onto him with an intensity that made his breath catch despite the pain racking his body. Ethan tried to speak, but his voice faltered. His dry lips parted, and all that came out was a weak rasp. The woman, no, the being, knelt beside him, her expression unreadable yet tinged with a softness that felt inexplicably tender. Her hands, elegant and delicate, hovered over his battered chest, and he felt a warmth radiating from her as though she carried the heat of a distant sun within her. "You are not meant to die here, human," she said, her voice a melody, a song that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his soul. The sound of it was unlike anything he had ever known, gentle yet commanding, alien yet achingly intimate. Ethan's eyelids fluttered again, his strength ebbing away. Her words lingered, wrapping around him like a balm. He wanted to respond, to ask her who she was, why she had come, but the effort was too great. His vision darkened at the edges, the world around him fading into shadows. And then, he felt her touch. It was not like the touch of another human. It was warm, yes, but it carried something deeper, an energy that coursed through his body, spreading like fire and ice all at once. It ignited his nerves, stirring sensations he hadn't felt in years. Memories surfaced, unbidden and raw, flashes of laughter, love, loss, and the quiet moments that had defined his humanity. Her energy wasn't just healing his body, it was unraveling him, peeling back layers of who he was and laying him bare. The connection was immediate, visceral, and overwhelming. It was as if she could see into the very core of him, every fear, every longing laid open for her to witness. His body shuddered under the intensity of it, a mix of pain and pleasure that left him trembling. Her gaze never wavered, her expression steady but tinged with something that felt familiar. Understanding, empathy, perhaps even compassion. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper now, so soft it felt like a caress against his battered spirit. "Stay with me," she said, her words laced with urgency, but also something more, something unspoken, something that tightened the space between them. Ethan's breath hitched, his fingers loosening their grip on the medallion. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment, as her energy surrounded him, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. Not just alive, connected. To her. To something far greater than himself. And for the first time since the crash, hope flickered. Not because he believed he would survive, but because of her. This strange, beautiful being who had pulled him from the brink. She was more than just a medic. She was something he couldn't yet comprehend, but he knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Not while she was here. The warmth radiating from Lyra's hands was unlike anything Ethan had ever felt. It wasn't just heat. It was a gentle, flowing energy that seemed to seep through his skin and into his very essence. His body, battered and broken moments ago, began to respond, the dull ache in his chest easing with each passing second. The connection between them deepened, unspoken and profound, as if her touch reached far beyond the physical. She worked in silence at first, her glowing hands tracing over his injuries, not quite touching yet undeniably present. Each motion was deliberate, graceful, and hypnotic. Ethan felt something stirring deep within him, memories long buried, emotions carefully locked away. He didn't understand how, but she was drawing them out, layer by layer, as if unearthing hidden pieces of him with every movement. Lyra finally spoke, her voice soft but resonant, carrying an almost musical cadence. "Your body is resilient, human," she said, the faintest hint of curiosity threading through her tone. "But your spirit, it carries a weight that hinders you." Ethan wanted to respond, to ask her what she meant, but his throat tightened as a wave of warmth surged through him. It was as if her touch wasn't just mending his wounds but unraveling a part of him he hadn't dared confront. His vision blurred, not with pain, but with the intensity of emotions flooding his senses. "What are you doing to me?" he finally managed, his voice rough and barely audible. "I am healing you," Lyra replied simply, her eyes meeting his. Those eyes, they held him captive, shimmering with colors that seemed to shift and dance like liquid light. "Your body is strong, but healing is never just physical. The pain you carry is more than flesh and bone." Ethan tried to protest, to push back against her words, but his mind betrayed him. Images began to surface, unbidden and vivid. His mother's laugh, warm and comforting. The night sky over his childhood home, stars scattered like diamonds. The soft hum of his father's voice, reading stories by the fire. And then the darker memories, the ones he had tried so hard to bury. Friends lost in battle. The hollow ache of loneliness on distant outposts. The crushing weight of guilt that came from surviving when others hadn't. Lyra's touch remained steady, her hands moving to his chest. Her fingers hovered just above his heart, and Ethan felt a deep, soothing warmth spread from within. It wasn't just physical, it was something else entirely, a sensation that defied words. Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "Do you feel it?" Ethan nodded, his breath catching as another wave of energy coursed through him. It wasn't just healing, it was as if she were sharing something of herself, blending her essence with his. He felt her presence within him, gentle but unyielding, as if she were holding him together from the inside out. "You're different," Ethan murmured, his voice trailing off as he struggled to put the feeling into words. Lyra tilted her head, her expression unreadable yet tinged with something that felt like understanding. "I am Cerithian," she said, as if that alone explained everything. "My people have evolved beyond physical medicine. Our methods are unconventional to those who do not understand." Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together what she meant, but the energy she was channeling into him made it hard to focus. It was overwhelming, not in a painful way but in its sheer intensity. It was as if every nerve in his body was alive, humming with sensation. "And this connection?" Ethan asked hesitantly. Lyra hesitated for the briefest of moments, her gaze flickering as if weighing her response. "It is part of the process," she said finally. "To heal, I must feel. To feel, I must connect. Our energies must align, intertwine." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan wasn't sure if it was the healing process or something else entirely, but he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. It wasn't just gratitude or fascination, it was deeper, more primal, something that went beyond logic or reason. As if sensing his thoughts, Lyra leaned closer, her presence both soothing and electric. "You are unlike any human I have encountered," she said, her voice low. "There is something about you. Something I cannot ignore." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to make of the strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him wanted to pull away, to guard himself from whatever this was. But another part, a louder, deeper part, wanted to stay, to let her in. Her hands moved again, this time to his face. Her touch was featherlight, her fingers tracing the edges of the gash on his temple. Ethan felt his heart quicken, his breath shallow. The warmth in her touch was intoxicating, stirring feelings he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Ethan," she said softly, and the sound of his name on her lips sent a shiver through him. "You are healing, but it will take time. You must let yourself feel. Do not fight it." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Ethan allowed himself to let go. The walls he had built around himself began to crumble, piece by piece, as Lyra's energy enveloped him. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the moment, to her. The battlefield around them faded into nothingness, and all that remained was the strange, beautiful connection between them, a bond that was as intimate as it was inexplicable. For the first time since the crash, Ethan felt whole. Not because he was healed, but because of her. Because of the way she had reached into the depths of him and pulled him back from the edge. And as he opened his eyes and met her gaze, he realized he didn't want this moment to end. The interior of Lyra's vessel was unlike anything Ethan had ever imagined. It wasn't the cold, sterile environment he had come to expect from advanced alien technology. Instead, it was warm and organic, as though the ship itself were alive. The walls pulsed faintly with a soft, bioluminescent glow, casting the space in hues of gold and silver. Ethan felt the ship respond to Lyra's presence as she moved, its surfaces shifting subtly, almost imperceptibly, as though it were aware of her every step. She guided him gently to a reclining platform that molded itself to his shape the moment he sat down. Ethan felt the tension in his body ease, the ship's atmosphere soothing him in ways he couldn't explain. Yet, despite the comfort, a knot of unease lingered in his chest. Lyra stood across from him, her luminous eyes studying him with an intensity that made him feel both exposed and seen in a way he couldn't fully understand. She was quiet for a moment, her elegant hands clasped in front of her, as though searching for the right words. "The process is not yet complete," she said finally, her voice calm but edged with something Ethan couldn't place. "Your physical wounds are healing, but there is more to be done." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his fingers absently brushing the smooth fabric of the platform beneath him. "More to be done," he echoed. Lyra nodded, stepping closer. "The bond we share now, it is not temporary, not entirely. My methods of healing require a connection, one that reaches beyond the physical and into the emotional and energetic." She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the floor for the briefest of moments before returning to his. "For a time, you and I are linked. I can feel you, Ethan, in ways you might find disconcerting." Ethan's throat tightened, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He shifted uncomfortably, his thoughts racing. The idea that she could feel him, truly feel him, in ways no one else ever had, was both thrilling and unnerving. "So, what does that mean?" he asked, his voice low. "It means I know you," Lyra replied softly. "Not just your pain, but your desires, your fears, your hopes. Everything that makes you human." Her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He didn't know how to respond, the vulnerability of her statement cutting through him like a blade. For years, he had guarded himself, burying his emotions beneath layers of armor, both literal and figurative. Now, in the span of moments, this alien woman had unraveled him, exposing parts of himself he wasn't ready to face. "You didn't ask," he said finally, his voice sharper than he intended. "You didn't ask if I wanted this connection?" Lyra's expression softened, a trace of sadness flickering across her features. "You are right," she said quietly. "I acted without your consent. But if I had not, you would not be alive. Your injuries were too severe for conventional methods." She paused, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "I did what I thought was right. But I understand if that is difficult for you to accept." Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping. He couldn't deny the truth in her words. If she hadn't intervened, he would be dead, his body left to rot on the battlefield. Yet, the intimacy of the connection she described was overwhelming. It wasn't just about healing, it was something far more personal, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. He met her gaze, the glow of her eyes unwavering. "And what about you?" he asked, his tone softening. "What does this connection mean for you?" Lyra hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of a nearby console. "For my people, the act of healing is sacred. It is not merely a duty, it is a sharing of ourselves. When I heal, I give a part of myself to you. And in return, I take a part of you into me." Ethan's breath caught, her words stirring something deep within him. "So, you feel what I feel?" "Yes," she said simply. "Your emotions, your memories, they become a part of me, just as mine become a part of you. It is intimate. And it is not without consequence." Ethan frowned. "Consequence?" Lyra's gaze dropped, her expression heavy. "There are rules, Ethan. Laws that govern my people's interactions with other species. What I have done is forbidden." She looked at him then, her eyes shimmering with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "If my actions are discovered, I will face severe punishment. But when I saw you lying there, on the brink of death, I could not ignore you. I could not let you die." Her voice cracked slightly, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He hadn't considered the risk she had taken, the price she might pay for saving him. "Why?" he asked, the word escaping before he could stop it. "Why would you risk so much for me?" Lyra stepped closer, the faint glow of her skin illuminating the space between them. "Because you are extraordinary," she said softly. "Humans, your resilience, your capacity for emotion, it is unlike anything I have ever encountered. You burn so brightly, even in the face of death. I could not let that light be extinguished." Ethan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't know what to say, the intensity of the moment leaving him speechless. All he knew was that, despite the confusion and uncertainty, he felt something stirring within him, something that had been dormant for far too long. Lyra's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. "I do not regret saving you," she said finally. "But I understand if you cannot forgive me for what I have done." Ethan shook his head, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm not sure I even understand what you've done." Lyra smiled faintly, the expression both sad and tender. "Then perhaps it is something we will both have to learn together." And with that, she turned, her movements as fluid and graceful as ever, leaving Ethan to grapple with the flood of emotions and questions that swirled within him. For the first time in years, he felt alive, not just in body but in spirit, and it was all because of her. Ethan sat on the reclining platform, its surface continuing to mold around him in a way that felt strangely comforting, almost alive. The glow from the walls cast a soft light over the room, accentuating the serene yet otherworldly ambience. Lyra stood a short distance away, her gaze steady, the glow of her skin reflecting faintly in her luminous eyes. She approached him with the same grace she always carried, her movements deliberate, her presence calming yet electrifying. "We've begun the process," she said, her voice gentle, "but the deeper healing requires more than what I've done so far. Your body is mending, yes, But the wounds that linger within, they are far older, far deeper. Ethan's brow furrowed. What do you mean by deeper wounds? His tone carried a mix of curiosity and unease, the idea of being laid bare in ways he couldn't fully understand gnawing at him. Lyra reached out, her hands hovering just above his chest, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. Our bodies and minds are not separate. They are threads of the same fabric, intertwined. Pain buried within you, grief, regret, longing, these things weaken the thread. To truly heal, we must tend to them as well. Her words lingered, and Ethan felt an odd weight in his chest, as if her explanation had stirred something just beneath the surface. And how exactly do you do that? Lyra stepped closer, the glow of her presence now brushing against him like a warm tide. I will guide you through your own memories, emotions, and desires. The process will be intimate, but it is necessary. If you allow it, I can help you let go of the pain you carry. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. There was no deception in her expression, no hidden motives, only a quiet understanding and an unmistakable sincerity. Swallowing hard, he nodded. Okay, let's do it. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, and she placed her hands lightly on either side of his head, her fingers brushing his temples. The touch was electric, sending a ripple of warmth through his body that left him breathless. Her eyes locked onto his, their opalescent glow intensifying as she closed the space between them. Breathe, she murmured, her voice soft yet commanding. Let go. Ethan took a deep breath, the tension in his shoulders easing as her energy began to flow into him. It wasn't like before. This was deeper, more intense, as if she were pouring a part of herself into him, wrapping his very soul in a cocoon of warmth and light. The world around him faded, and suddenly, he wasn't in the ship anymore. He was somewhere else entirely. The first memory hit him like a wave, sharp and vivid, as if he were reliving it in real time. He was a child, running through a sunlit field, the laughter of his younger self filling the air. He could feel the grass beneath his bare feet, smell the wildflowers swaying in the breeze. A voice called out to him, his mother's voice, warm and full of love. He turned, seeing her standing at the edge of the field, her arms open wide. The joy of the moment was overwhelming, pure and untainted, and he felt tears sting his eyes. But the memory shifted, the brightness fading into shadow. He was older now, standing at the graveside of a friend, the weight of loss pressing down on him like a physical force. The pain was raw, jagged, and it tore through him as if it had only just happened. He felt Lyra's presence then, not just beside him but within him, her energy wrapping around the memory like a salve on an open wound. You carry so much, she whispered, her voice resonating in the space between them. It's no wonder you've felt so broken. Ethan's breath hitched as the memory dissolved, replaced by another. He was on a starship, staring out at the endless expanse of space. Loneliness clawed at him, a constant companion in the quiet void. But as the memory played out, he felt Lyra's energy shift, a steady pulse that countered the emptiness, filling the space within him with a warmth he hadn't realized he was missing. You are not alone, she said softly, her voice like a balm to his frayed nerves. Not anymore. The memories continued, each one more intense than the last. Moments of love, of heartbreak, of joy and sorrow, all of them laid bare. And through it all, Lyra was there, her presence steady and unwavering, guiding him through the torrent of emotions with a tenderness that left him both vulnerable and comforted. But then, the energy shifted, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar, a memory that wasn't his. He was standing on a distant planet, its surface barren and windswept. The air was heavy with sorrow, the sky above dark and oppressive. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a longing that wasn't his own. And then he saw her, Lyra, kneeling beside the lifeless form of another Cerithian, her hands trembling as she tried to save them. The pain in her eyes was unlike anything he had ever seen, a grief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. "This is your memory," Ethan said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Yes, she replied, her tone heavy with emotion. It is my burden, just as yours are yours. Healing is not without cost. Ethan's heart ached at the sight of her pain, the vulnerability she had shared with him. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and for the first time, he felt the connection between them solidify. It wasn't just her healing him, nor him understanding her, it was something more, something deeper. As the memory faded, they found themselves back in the ship, the glow of its walls casting soft light over them once more. Lyra's hands slipped from his temples, her expression weary but serene. Ethan reached for her, his fingers brushing against hers, and she didn't pull away. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Lyra's gaze softened, and for a moment, the space between them seemed to shrink. "You are stronger than you realize, Ethan. And I am grateful to have been a part of your journey." The connection between them lingered, unspoken yet undeniable, and Ethan knew in that moment that he had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for. Lyra wasn't just a healer, she was a part of him now, just as he was a part of her, and whatever lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. Ethan leaned back against the softly glowing wall of Lyra's vessel, his body relaxed but his mind far from at ease. He could still feel the lingering warmth of her energy coursing through him, like the echo of a touch that had gone far deeper than skin. She sat across from him, her posture as graceful as ever, her luminous eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel both vulnerable and inexplicably safe. "You're quiet," Lyra said softly, her voice carrying the weight of an unspoken question. Ethan met her gaze, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Just trying to make sense of everything. Of you. Of this." He gestured vaguely between them, the words failing to encapsulate the complex tangle of emotions he felt. Lyra tilted her head, the motion almost curious. "Does it trouble you?" He shook his head slowly. "No. It's not that. It's just, humans aren't used to this kind of connection. We're not exactly open books, you know." Her lips parted slightly, as though she were tasting the meaning of his words. "Your emotions are vivid," she said after a moment. "They ripple through you like waves, raw and unfiltered. It is unlike anything I've experienced. My people, we suppress such things. We see them as distractions, weaknesses." Ethan frowned. "Weaknesses? I wouldn't call them that. Sure, emotions can be messy, but they're what make us human. They're what drive us to love, to fight, to keep going even when everything feels impossible." Lyra's expression softened, her eyes reflecting a quiet longing. "That is what fascinates me. Your capacity to feel so deeply, even in the face of suffering. To find beauty in chaos." She paused, her gaze drifting for a moment as if searching for something just out of reach. "Perhaps that is why I could not let you die." Ethan chuckled, the sound light but genuine. "You're starting to sound like a romantic." Lyra's eyes flicked back to his, a glimmer of amusement breaking through her otherwise composed demeanor. "Perhaps I am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps you are the reason." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, his chest tightening with a sensation he couldn't quite name. Her gaze never wavered, and he found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn to her in a way that defied logic or reason. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "Do you ever feel? Or is that something your people have completely forgotten?" Lyra's expression shifted, her eyes dimming slightly. "We feel," she admitted. "But we are taught to bury it, to see it as unnecessary. Emotions complicate judgment, and my people value precision above all else." Ethan studied her, his brow furrowing. "That sounds lonely." Her gaze dropped, and for the first time, she looked almost uncertain. "It is," she admitted, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "But it is our way. Or it was, until now." Ethan reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing against hers where they rested on the edge of the platform. The contact was brief, tentative, but it sent a jolt through both of them. Lyra's eyes snapped to his, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the ship around them. "Ethan," she began, her voice faltering slightly. "This connection between us, it is unusual. Even for me. I cannot explain it, but it feels as though I am drawn to you. In ways I do not fully understand." He swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "I feel it too," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "It's like I've known you forever, even though we just met. And it scares the hell out of me." Her lips curved into a faint, almost wistful smile. "Perhaps that is what makes it real." The space between them seemed to shrink, the tension building like a quiet storm. Ethan's hand lingered near hers, his fingers brushing against her skin once more. This time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand, letting her fingers intertwine with his. The warmth of her touch was electric, sending a shiver down his spine. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, until Lyra leaned in ever so slightly, her gaze locked onto his. Ethan mirrored her movement, his breath hitching as their faces drew closer. When their lips finally met, it was hesitant at first, a gentle exploration that spoke of both curiosity and restraint. Her touch was soft, her lips warm and inviting, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. But the hesitation didn't last. The kiss deepened, growing in intensity, their connection surging like a tide that refused to be held back. Ethan felt her energy intertwine with his, not just physically but on a level that defied comprehension. It was as though she were pouring herself into him, her essence mingling with his in a way that left him breathless. The sensations were overwhelming, a blend of warmth, light, and emotion that swept through him like a wildfire. He could feel her pain, her longing, her unspoken fears, and she could feel him in return. It was intimate in a way that words could never capture, a merging of souls that left no part of him untouched. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. Ethan's heart was racing, his body trembling from the intensity of what they had just shared. Lyra's eyes searched his, her expression a mix of wonder and vulnerability. "I have never," she began, her voice trailing off as if she couldn't find the words. "Me neither," Ethan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want it to stop." Lyra smiled then, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up the space around them. "Neither do I." And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the ship, not the galaxy, not the rules that had brought them together or the consequences that might tear them apart. All that mattered was the connection they shared, a bond that defied logic, reason, and even time itself. The silence in the ship was soothing, a calm cocoon that surrounded Ethan and Lyra as they sat together, their connection as undeniable as it was fragile. Ethan had never felt anything like this before, a bond so profound it seemed to defy everything he thought he knew about relationships, about emotions, about himself. Lyra sat close, her presence radiant and grounding all at once, her gaze resting softly on his face. But the serenity didn't last. A low chime broke through the stillness, sharp and insistent. Lyra froze, her eyes narrowing as the sound repeated, each tone more urgent than the last. Ethan sat up, the calm he had been basking in shattered by the sudden tension in the air. "What is that?" he asked, his voice cautious. Lyra stood, her movements swift and deliberate as she approached a nearby console. Her glowing hands moved over the smooth surface, summoning a projection that pulsed with vibrant alien symbols. Her expression hardened, a flicker of unease crossing her features. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "They found me." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "They? My people," she replied, her voice low. "The Cerithian Council. They've detected my interference with your species." Ethan's stomach churned as the weight of her words settled over him. He rose to his feet, his body still not entirely steady, but his concern for her overriding his own lingering weakness. "What does that mean? What are they going to do?" Lyra turned to him then, her gaze steady but filled with something he couldn't quite place. It means I have broken the law. I have acted without authorization, violating one of the core principles of our code. The Council will expect me to erase all traces of this interaction, including your memories. The words hit him like a blow, the idea of losing everything they had shared in an instant almost too much to process. Erase my memories? He repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. You can't be serious. It is the only way to protect you and myself, Lyra said, her tone resolute but pained. If they believe you remember, they will hunt you, and they will hold me accountable for endangering our treaty with your species. Ethan shook his head, his chest tightening. No. No way. You've already saved my life twice. I won't let them take that away from me. From us? Lyra's expression softened, a flicker of emotion breaking through her composed exterior. Ethan, I don't want to do this, she said quietly. But if they discover what we've shared, what I've done, the consequences will be severe. For both of us. He stepped closer to her, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Then let me leave, he said, his voice firm. If I go, they won't find me. You won't have to do anything. Her gaze dropped, the glow of her skin dimming as she turned away. It's not that simple. Our connection, it's not something I can sever easily. Even if you left, they would sense the bond. They would know. Ethan reached for her, his fingers brushing against her arm. She flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. Lyra, he said, his voice softer now, laced with something raw and unguarded. You don't have to do this. We can figure it out together. We can find a way. She turned back to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't want to forget this. I don't want to forget you. Her words cut through him, leaving him breathless. He stepped closer, his hand moving to cup her face, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek. Then don't, he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. Don't let them take this away from us. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Lyra's eyes searched his, her expression a mix of fear and longing. Ethan, you don't know what you're asking. The risks? I don't care about the risks, he interrupted, his voice firm. You've already done the impossible for me. You've shown me something I didn't think I'd ever find again. I'm not letting that go. The tension between them was electric, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Lyra's resolve wavered, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his conviction. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she leaned into his touch. I can't lose you, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You won't, Ethan promised, his hand slipping to the back of her neck as he pulled her closer. We'll figure this out. Together. The moment hung between them, fragile and powerful, as the reality of their situation loomed over them like a shadow. But in that instant, nothing else mattered. Not the council, not the warnings, not the impossible odds stacked against them. All that mattered was the connection they shared, a bond that defied logic, reason, and even the laws of the universe. Lyra's hands came up to rest against his chest, her fingers trembling slightly as she leaned into him. You are extraordinary, Ethan Cade, she said softly, her voice tinged with awe and sadness. More than you realize. And so are you, he replied, his voice steady and resolute. And I'm not letting them take that away from me. The warning signal continued to chime in the background, a reminder of the danger that loomed just beyond the walls of the ship. But for now, it was distant, a noise that neither of them could bring themselves to acknowledge. All that mattered was this moment, this connection, this promise they had made to one another. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The hum of Lyra's ship shifted suddenly, a low vibration rippling through the air, signaling a change neither of them could ignore. The faint glow of the walls dimmed momentarily, then brightened again, this time accompanied by a soft but insistent tone. Lyra froze, her posture stiffening as her gaze darted to the central console. Ethan didn't need to ask what it meant. He could see it in her face. They're here, she murmured, her voice quiet but heavy. Ethan followed her as she moved swiftly to the console, her hands gliding over its smooth surface. A projection materialized, shimmering with alien symbols that Ethan couldn't decipher but instinctively understood to be a warning. Lyra's jaw tightened, her usually serene expression etched with something close to anguish. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but low. Lyra hesitated, her hands stilling for a moment before she turned to face him. "They've intercepted us. They will demand my compliance. And if I refuse," she trailed off, her meaning clear without needing to finish the sentence. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Then give me up," he said simply. "Hand me over. If it keeps you safe, it's worth it." No, the word came sharp and immediate, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned fully to him, her eyes blazing with emotion. "You don't understand. This isn't just about me. If I hand you over, they will not treat you as a person. To them, you are expendable, a problem to be erased. And I will not allow that to happen." Ethan's chest tightened at her words, a wave of frustration and helplessness rising within him. "Lyra, I'm not worth the risk. If this costs you your life—" "Stop," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You don't get to decide that. You think you're not worth it because you've been taught to see yourself as small in a universe that feels vast and indifferent. But you are worth it, Ethan. Your people are worth it. I see something in humanity that my kind has long forgotten, and I will not stand by and let them destroy that." Her words hit him harder than he expected, leaving him momentarily speechless. She turned back to the console, her hands moving with purpose now, the projections shifting as she worked. He watched her in silence for a moment, the weight of her resolve settling over him. "What are you doing?" he finally asked, stepping closer. "Buying us time," she said, her voice tight with focus. "If I can disrupt their targeting systems, we might have a chance to escape. But it won't be easy. Their ships are faster, and they will not hesitate to destroy us if they think we're a threat." Ethan frowned, his mind racing. "Then let's give them something to chase. If we can lead them into an asteroid field or somewhere with enough interference." Lyra's head tilted slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile despite the tension. "You're thinking like a soldier. Old habits die hard," he replied, a small, wry grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You said it yourself, I'm resilient." She didn't respond immediately, her hands continuing to move over the console. Finally, she looked up at him, her expression softening. "I trust you, Ethan. If we're going to do this, we do it together." The ship trembled slightly, a subtle vibration that signaled the presence of the Cerithian interceptors drawing closer. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, but it only sharpened his focus. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the projections as he pieced together what little he could understand. "We need a distraction," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Something to draw their attention long enough for us to make our move." Lyra nodded, her fingers dancing across the console. "I can release a burst of energy from the ship's core. It will mimic a destabilization in our systems. They'll think we're vulnerable and focus on containment rather than destruction. And while they're distracted, we slip away," Ethan finished, his mind already working through the logistics. "Where can we go that they won't follow?" "There's a nebula not far from here," Lyra said, her tone thoughtful. "The electromagnetic interference will make it difficult for them to track us. But we'll have to be fast." Ethan nodded, his determination solidifying. "Let's do it." Lyra's hands moved with precision, the glow of the console reflecting off her skin. The ship hummed louder, a low vibration building as the energy core prepared to release. Ethan felt the tension in his chest tighten, his instincts sharpening as the moments ticked by. "Ready?" Lyra asked, her voice steady but laced with a hint of urgency. "Ready," Ethan replied, his gaze meeting hers. "Let's show them what we're made of." Lyra activated the energy burst, the ship shuddering as a bright flash of light erupted from its core. The interceptors hesitated, their formation breaking as they adjusted to the apparent malfunction. It was all the opening they needed. Ethan moved to the navigation controls, Lyra's instructions clear in his mind as he guided the ship toward the nebula. The vessel responded to his touch as if it could sense his intent, its movements smooth and precise. The interceptors followed, but the distance between them grew as the nebula came into view, a swirling mass of color and light, its electromagnetic field already causing interference on their systems. The ship plunged into the nebula, the interference enveloping them like a shield. The interceptors hesitated at the edge, their signals faltering as they tried to maintain a lock. Ethan held his breath, his grip on the controls tightening as he guided the ship deeper into the swirling chaos. Finally, the interceptors broke off, their signals fading as the nebula's interference overwhelmed their systems. Lyra let out a soft sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing as the tension eased. "We did it," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a quiet triumph. Ethan turned to her, a small smile breaking across his face. "Yeah, we did." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the danger and the chaos faded into the background. All that remained was the bond between them, unshaken and undeniable. The ship settled gently on the barren surface of the desolate moon, its landing marked only by the faint hum of its systems powering down. The moon was quiet, its vast, cratered plains bathed in the pale light of a distant sun. The atmosphere was thin but breathable, the air crisp and cool as Ethan and Lyra stepped out onto the surface. For the first time in what felt like hours, the tension in the air began to dissipate, leaving behind a heavy, exhausted calm. Ethan stood a few steps away from the ship, his boots crunching softly against the dusty ground as he surveyed their surroundings. The stillness of the moon was almost eerie, but after the chaos of their escape, it felt like a sanctuary. He glanced over his shoulder at Lyra, who remained near the ship, her luminous eyes fixed on the horizon. "Not exactly paradise," he said, his voice breaking the silence, "but it's quiet." Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment before her lips curved into a faint smile. "Quiet is what we need right now." Ethan nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. The distant sun cast long shadows across the moon's surface, the light catching on the curves of the craters and the jagged edges of rocks scattered across the plain. It was a stark, unforgiving landscape, but in its simplicity, it held a strange beauty. After a moment, Lyra joined him, her movements as fluid and graceful as ever. She stood close, her presence warm against the chill of the moon's air. Ethan glanced at her, the faint glow of her skin reflecting the light of the distant sun, and he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, admiration, perhaps, or awe, or something deeper that he wasn't ready to put into words. "This is the longest I've been on solid ground in years," he said, his tone light but honest. "Feels strange, like I'm not supposed to be here." Lyra tilted her head, her eyes studying him with a mix of curiosity and understanding. "You've spent your life among the stars," she said softly. "It's no wonder you feel displaced. But here, now, you are alive. That is what matters." He looked at her, the sincerity in her voice striking a chord deep within him. "You're right," he said after a moment. "I'm alive because of you." Lyra's expression softened, her gaze dropping to the ground. "It wasn't just me," she said quietly. "You fought for this, for yourself, for us. You are stronger than you realize." Ethan smiled faintly, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know about that. Most of the time, I feel like I'm just stumbling my way through. But you're something else." She met his gaze then, her luminous eyes holding his with an intensity that left him breathless. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I've spent my entire life believing emotions were a weakness, that they clouded judgment, made us vulnerable. But you've shown me something I didn't think was possible." He tilted his head, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's that?" Her gaze faltered for a moment, her hands clasping in front of her as though she were searching for the right words. "That emotions, love, fear, hope, they aren't weaknesses. They are what give life meaning. I've felt more in these past days than I have in my entire existence, and it's because of you." Ethan's chest tightened at her words, the weight of her confession leaving him momentarily speechless. He reached for her then, his hand brushing against hers. "You've changed me too," he said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't think I could feel this way again. Not after everything I've been through. But with you, it's different. You make me want to be better. To be more." Lyra looked up at him, her expression a mix of vulnerability and determination. "Your people," she said softly, "they are extraordinary. Resilient, passionate, capable of such depth. I've spent so long observing, studying, but I never truly understood. Not until now." Ethan smiled, his thumb brushing against her hand. "Then let me show you. Let me show you what humanity is really capable of." She tilted her head, her eyes searching his. "And what is that?" He stepped closer, his voice quiet but resolute. "Love. Hope. The kind of connection that defies everything. If we can hold on to this, what we've found, then none of the rest matters. Not the rules, not the risk. Just us." Lyra's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, she leaned into him, her forehead resting gently against his. The warmth of her touch, the quiet steadiness of her breath, filled the space between them, and for a moment, the rest of the universe faded away. "Together," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with emotion. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Ethan nodded, his hands moving to cradle her face, his touch light and reverent. "Together," he echoed, the word carrying a promise that neither of them would break. The moon's silence wrapped around them like a cocoon, the distant sun casting its gentle light over the desolate landscape. They stood there, bound by a connection that defied reason and expectation, a bond forged in the crucible of chaos but tempered by something far greater. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt at peace. And as he held Lyra close, he knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. The stars stretched endlessly across the black canvas of space, their brilliance undimmed by the barren landscape of the moon. Ethan and Lyra sat side by side atop the ship, the metal hull warm beneath them from the faint residual heat of its systems. The air was still, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the vessel and their steady breaths. They had been quiet for a long time, neither needing words to fill the space between them. But the peace was fleeting. The faint chime from within the ship shattered the stillness, its tone neither sharp nor urgent, but undeniable. Lyra's shoulders tensed, and Ethan turned his gaze to her, catching the flicker of apprehension in her expression. Without a word, she stood and disappeared inside the ship, leaving him alone beneath the stars. Ethan followed moments later, his steps careful, his mind racing with possibilities. He found her at the console, her luminous eyes scanning the projection before her. The symbols shifted and danced in a pattern Ethan couldn't decipher, but Lyra's expression told him everything he needed to know. Something had changed. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his chest. Lyra didn't look at him at first. Her hands moved across the console, the symbols shifting in response, before she finally turned to meet his gaze. Her eyes were brighter than usual, the light within them unsteady. "It's from the council," she said, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. Ethan stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "What did they say?" She hesitated, the weight of her silence filling the room before she spoke again. "They've reached their decision. I've been exiled." The words hung between them, stark and final. Ethan felt a rush of anger and disbelief, but he kept it in check, his focus entirely on her. "Exiled? For saving a life?" Lyra nodded, her gaze dropping to the console. "For interfering. For breaking their laws. To them, my actions were reckless, a threat to the balance they believe they've created. They see what I've done as unforgivable." Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, the injustice of it sparking a fire in his chest. "So, that's it? They just cast you out? After everything you've given them?" Her lips curved into a faint, bitter smile. "It's not unexpected. I knew the risks when I chose to save you. And if I had to make the choice again, I would do the same. He stepped closer, his hands finding hers. You don't deserve this, Lyra. She met his gaze then, her expression softening. Perhaps not. But it is the reality I must accept. I can never return home. I am free in a way. But that freedom comes with a cost. Ethan tightened his grip on her hands, his resolve hardening. Then we'll make our own home. Out here, among the stars. You don't have to face this alone. Lyra studied him, her luminous eyes searching his. Ethan, this life, it will not be easy. We will be fugitives, outcasts. Always moving, always looking over our shoulders. Are you certain this is what you want? He didn't hesitate. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Wherever we go, whatever happens, I want to be with you. Her breath caught, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her defenses. She stepped closer, her hands moving to his face, her touch as light as a whisper. You are extraordinary, she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. To choose this, to choose me. Ethan smiled, his hands settling on her waist. I'm not choosing you, Lyra. We're choosing each other. The distance between them vanished, their foreheads touching as they stood together in the quiet hum of the ship. The weight of their shared decision settled over them, but it wasn't heavy. It was grounding, a reminder of the bond that had brought them here. We'll chart a new course, Ethan said, his voice steady. Find the places no one else dares to go. And we'll do it together. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Together, she echoed, the word carrying a promise neither of them would break. They moved in unison then, their lips meeting in a kiss that was neither hesitant nor restrained. It was passionate and consuming, a declaration of everything they had fought for and everything they still had to face. Lyra's hands tangled in his hair, her energy flowing into him like a tidal wave, and Ethan held her closer, the warmth of her presence filling every corner of his being. The stars outside the ship seemed to burn brighter, their light spilling through the windows and casting a soft glow over them. They broke apart only when the need for air forced them to, their foreheads resting together as their breaths mingled in the stillness. We'll be okay, Ethan said softly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Lyra nodded, her fingers brushing against his cheek. Yes, we will. And as the ship prepared to take off, its engines humming to life, the two of them stood together, their hands entwined, their gazes locked on the stars ahead. The galaxy stretched before them, vast and uncharted, and for the first time, it felt like home. If you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.